All right. Welcome, everyone, to our first session of day two, which is titled Designing Green. Our first presenter this morning is going to be Simone Hubert. And so, Simone, go ahead and take it away.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. Good morning to everyone in America. You can read my slides. So probably you're also wondering what board turned green. So let me show you the teaser I sent out via my newsletter to announce this conference. But don't be scared. This is rather illustrative, the use of Monopoly. So there's no in-depth analysis like we heard yesterday about Pax Pamir, just this time about a game everybody hates. You can this time expect a rather conceptual talk with some speculative thoughts I'm pondering as a historian of games play and culture. So this should be a helpful construction to bridge a gap, I perceive, between the recent, colorful, vibrant board game scene today and those things that archaeologists are excavating, crude patterns, and then reconstructing the rules from cuneiform and providing more and more evidence that for the assumption that we have, as humans, have always been gaming. So to put it shorter, between board game geek on the one side and the origins of chess on the other, I assume there is a modern difference that accounts for cultural changes beginning in the late Middle Ages. I stole this slide from my colleague yesterday. Thank you for that. Because I'm kind of all those three Spider-Man and in search of a coherent ludology, which is not opposed to narratology, but is very much situated between the scientific discourses that seek to gain traction by focusing on the materiality of games and play. And in this talk, I want to address color itself as such a materiality. Why is this relevant? One more little detour. I brought you a picture from the cultural initiative Rooming In, which I'm a part of, and we are running a living lab to explore the playability of the cityscape. So we are convinced that children and young people should have their say in city planning, and we're looking for the right interface to do so, because kids are continuously excluded from public space. This generation is losing what Jonathan Haidt calls a play-based childhood. So they might be have access to brilliant smartphone games, but they are getting addicted and lose their connection to their surroundings. So of course, I would say they need to become acquainted again what we once called nature. And we need to redesign cities in ways that are best conceived as playable. So if you look closely at this card, it has already been transformed into a herb garden. And currently we are preparing a tournament, a street soccer tournament on the street before where this photo is taken to reclaim public space for games and play. So also in this picture, you see on the sides our first attempts for a permaculture garden, including play spaces designed by children themselves, edible plants, stuff like that they can reconnect. So I'm attempting to conceptualize games and play in a way that covers not only entertainment products by professional designers, but also child's play, sports, or to put it in Heusinger's words, play as the origin of culture. So now let us go back in time 360 years when I think this educational role of games and play was discovered. This is woodcut from the Orbis Pictus, the first pictorial encyclopedia, which I assume to be the first virtualized world that the reader, who's now becoming a player by thumbing through the book, can navigate the space. 150 comprehensive chapters offering each one woodcut. And the numbers you also see in this picture connect image and vocabulary, allowing the reader to navigate the world through the pictures. So it's written in Latin and German in the first version, and many other languages followed. I counted 27. So therefore, this chapter has now two names, Ludus Alea, das Brettspiel. It is followed by an explanation of what is to be seen. And those of you who know their Latin will also notice that here dice games are actually translated to board games, an important shift in meaning. So from the top of the picture, you see the chance is kind of like the dice falling down through this on this board. So this central element of inferior games, how it is explained, is contrasted by chess, which is introduced as the most ingenious of all games, as it is purely cognitive and thus superior also to games of chance and skill, which are displayed on the right side of this picture. And it's going into the depth of the image space, like the direction of this pieces you are playing with. So these are skill-based games, some kind of shuffleboard we're seeing here, curling, but for sure a form of playing with one's own switch skills. And in the middle here, the backgammon board represents the mixed games where you combine all these elements: chance, dexterity, and cognitive skills. So you compete in backgammon as such a hybrid of dice, a board, and pieces that you move. And again, next to this, almost hidden, there are the card games. Card games are neither one nor the other. They are not boards, they are not dice, and yet they can contain all these things together. That's why I think cards are crucial playing cards. For recalling the history of board games by centering on playing cards makes Monopoly a milestone, as it combines cards and board, and thus folding immensely more depth into the tabletop space. I'm very curious about to hear what you think. If that's, I couldn't found any other game where cards and board are combined in one title. So recalling the history of board games. So the cards. So I'm gonna show you now from the cards to Monopoly what color regimes were introduced and how they came about. First, cards were printed and then colored by hand. So the four suits, spades, hearts, clubs, and diamonds, make up the French deck. That was preferable because of its simplicity. And red was added to the black and white color economy and actually applied afterwards by hand. So red is a printing convention for highlighting. Some of you may also have wondered when looking at contemporary style sheets why we leave white space at the beginning of a paragraph. This comes from the medieval way of producing books, reserving a space for the decorative initial letter. So in the earliest prints, some letters were left out and added in a second step in red. The term rubrication comes from these practices of highlighting. And in German, Rubrik is something like a chapter or a ressort. So something, a general classification of things. So in the beginning, there were we have black, white, and red as color economy, where red signifies a symbolic difference. Mainly, it's about pattern differentiation. You can easily tell the suits apart, and if you have a fancy, beautiful deck where a lot of time was invested into, then you can also color the face cards predominantly blue and yellow. Obviously, they were also easier to produce than a nice green color. So where does green come from? Later on, we see here a variation of the standard French card deck, the Lenormand future telling cards. In this particular case, a symbolic layer is added to the standard deck. So another order of numbers, starting here with 1, going up to 36. And each of these cards are depicting an object or a person or a scene with a symbolic meaning for fortune telling. And they're also paired with the usual order of the French pack. And in this case, again, parsed with the German suits here, bells instead of diamonds, for example. So I think this is a prototypical interface for cards that is now coming back in Magic the Gathering, for example, because instead of a picture giving you a panoramatic view or for some lore on the lore behind the game, while the game relevant information surrounds it, making it an interface for the competitive gameplay. And this game, on the other hand, here's a later edition, which was printed with chromolithography. So now we have a broader range of color, a broader spectrum, and we can print it it can go in mass production in color. And so from a media historical perspective, this card game could also be transformed into a board game space, and it was. It was released as Spiel der Hoffnung in Germany, translated to Game of Hope, a landscape traversed with the help of dice and playing pieces as soon as the cards are laid out and forming this course. At this point, I can also hint to a beautiful book by Ernst Strohal, Die Welt im Spiel, an atlas of playable landscapes, many of them produced in chromolithography, and it collects maps and landscapes across the centuries and sorts them in different topics and explains then again also the ideologies or so it shows us how this is a window to the time when they were produced. And I think that these landscapes could be a hint to why green became the first choice for the background color of Monopoly. Not so much because this mint green is in particular relevant here, but the chromolithography allowed generally for a broader color plate, and was then used. And green might be a good substitute. A calmer, a neutral placeholder for these landscapes that are printed on boards so often. Another reason or another way to explain this greenish color might be the pool board, or bia or snooker, which are all covered in bay, a French term for a fabric that was used to cover all these games, similar games of skill and gambling tables, and also office tables. So it was dyed green, probably to imitate the grass on which these kind of games originally took place, for example, croquet. They were domesticated and transferred from the outside into homes and cafes. There are also some biological explanations why people choose green intuitively, because we as apes are living, or our ancestors living among green trees. They were capable of distinguish red fruits easily from the green background. In the development of the Monopoly game now, with its endless variations, we can trace the same color economies. So the first version, the first iteration, the Landlord's Game by Lizzie Maggie, is just an ink drawing. Color was added later for marketing purposes. As soon as it was stolen, it was presented in red, black, and white to attract our attention. The contents of the first box were already greenish, reinforcing the image of green land to be acquired and developed. Or perhaps it's already also contextualizing the work of real estate investors as gamblers sitting at the casino's green table. But we also find many other paper media remediated: banknotes, deeds of ownership, chance cards, and so on. Finally, I also want to mention Monopoly Go Green, a perfect example of greenwashing. It is printed on what appears to be recycled paper, and it has bike lanes instead of railroads, but actually it's exactly just the same game. Just another example of how versatile Monopoly is while leaving underlying rule mechanics untouched, which it did in the first place, and it was stolen. Because Elizabeth Maggie's first version included cards also displaying bon mots for educational purposes. For example, Andrew Carnegie's saying that one man does all the labor while another one becomes rich. So the Landlord's Game was actually what we now call a serious game, turned into an ironic comment on the cynical ways of playing the game of life as a landowner. So here to sum it up, green became the default setting as soon as it was technically feasible, but somehow resonating also the idea of the tabletop as an immersive space that allows us to somehow change our environment and mitigate transformations through play. So I think there is some space, it leaves some space for negotiation. Also, the Monopoly rulebook lets us know that we can also negotiate prices freely, and this is not bound to any rules on the game, of the game by itself. So instead of now showing you my literary sources, I have some found footage. I was stumbling about when I was composing the slides here. It is a postcard, also printed in chromolithography. And here also you have the black and white typographic order. And there it gives us a Goethe quote, which is very, very common in German. Graut teurer Freund ist alle Theorie. And there's obviously there's somebody mansplaining the players here. Also the goose appear, like the game of goose. But the quote goes on, and it says, actually, all theory, dear friend, is gray, but the golden tree of life springs evergreen. So thank you for your attention, and I'm looking very forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Simon. Our next presenter is going to be Petr Gut. So, Petr, please take the wheel.
All right. Can you see my slides? I hope so.
Yes, we can.
Well, thanks. Thank you for having me. First of all, I'm really grateful to be here. I'm going to be presenting this fate condensed setting called Nalluvia that I created as part of my research methodology, and I call it an experiment in ontological design for relational urban futures in Prague. So these two quotes are kind of roots of my inspiration for why to do it. I really wanted to use the power of collaborative storytelling for research and for change. After studying human ecology for 2 years, where basically you are just told how bad the world is and how terrible climate change is, it was very depressing. And then I stumbled into this quote that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, and that really resonated. During the degree, I also read the assessment of values of nature from IPBES, which is basically like the International Intergovernmental Climate Panel, but for biodiversity. And they write that the value mix within the dominant global discourse or business as usual will not lead to just and sustainable outcomes in the future. If a just and sustainable future is to be achieved, then this value mix needs to change. And on top of that, I also began as a dungeon master, a home game of homebrew D&D, and that kind of connected to why do my friends really care about this forest I made up? There's some power in this tool to kind of transform imagination and stretch it out. And then I wanted to connect it to exploring values of nature based on this assessment. So this was my overarching research question, and I will just speed through this. It was, how do civic and NGO actors in Prague imagine urban nature futures, and how are these imaginaries shaped and constrained by prevailing values of nature? But I will point you to this sub-question here that reads, how does a collaborative workshop with TTRPG elements help interlocutors articulate, challenge, or transform their existing values and imaginaries of urban nature? So this was kind of the point of using a tabletop role-playing game as part of research. It was to give people the experience of immersion and a more effective layer to the research practice. It was a mixed method research. Here you can see a picture from one of the workshops. So the tabletop role-playing game was also complemented by action research workshops where participants brainstormed their utopian dreams and their critiques of the relationship to nature, but I also supplemented with ethnography. And then I did debrief interviews with them after the games. And I was also very inspired by this quote by Arturo Escobar's Designs for the Pluriverse, where he writes that the practice of transformation really takes place in the process of enacting other worlds and practices. That is, in changing radically the ways in which we encounter things and people, not just theorizing about such practice. And this last sentence here, not just theorizing about such practice, was what I really wanted to take seriously. And that's why I decided to use this experiment and use tabletop role-playing game as part of a research method, because it was, for me, a way to enact being in the world and researching differently. So what was it? How is this setting an ontological approach to design? So Escobar is using Anna Mary Willis's insight that design designs, meaning that the way we design the world and our being in the world also designs us back. And that's what's meant by an ontological approach to design. And I really wanted my own research practice to be as a world making towards a more relational being in the world through the game design. So Nalluvia is a fictional city where global capital meets relational ontologies on an equal footing. For those who don't know, Prague is undergoing a huge affordability housing crisis. It's really hard to live in the city if you don't have a really good job, and it's a struggle. It's almost impossible to get a mortgage. So it was important for me to reflect this in the game, but I also wanted to give my players the chance to fight back and take decolonial theories and these relational ontologies seriously. So I made them institutional rooted. I did that by basically the players played habitat mediators, which is a job I made up, where their job was to, as part of a legitimized institution, to come up with the best balance between people and nature. Kind of, where is that emergent best balance? Imagine if that was a job, that would be a great job. And I made it as pre-made characters in Fate Condense. They were gifted, meaning they also had superpowers. And in those superpowers, I tried to embed the relational approaches. So they could speak to the more than human beings around them. Some of them could shapeshift into different animals. Some of them could perceive material flows in commodities just by touching them and stuff like that. So that's the way I tried to kind of embed this relationality, the interdependence of the world that Escobar also writes about, into the game mechanics. And then I used Ruth Levitas' theory of utopia, where she writes about utopia as a method, as a practice, not just as a dream. And she writes that through that, we can see that as an education of desire in a way that's teaching us to desire differently, less overconsumption, for example. And I see this as an education of relationality. Now there's some art here. I had the sessions recorded and asked my very good friend and illustrator Adriana Kratka, if you're here, Adriana, thank you so much, to listen to the recordings, to the stories, and then create art from what inspires her. So here, that's one of the pictures she created. One of the reasons why I chose Fate as a rule set is that it's very open and it gives more power and more agency to the players. It's also easier to learn because I only had half an hour to explain the rules before we played. And part of this choice was also to release control from me as the researcher and the person who leads the game. So the story was really emergent between all of us at the table during the game. For example, this was one of the characters. She was a feminist beekeeper selling honey called Buzz of Patriarchy. Now, what was the story? The story was inspired by real world, by a redevelopment of a city park in the center of Budapest. I wanted to make it close to my players in Prague, but not something they have actually lived themselves. And in this redevelopment, Orbán's government is redeveloping the central park and putting a lot of very big, nice new buildings to kind of build these monuments to himself and his nationalist view of Hungary. So in the game, a museum building should replace an ancient linden tree called Tilia. And Tilia was kind of a central node and very important being in the more than human community and also the human community of this place. And this museum building won an architectural sustainable reward, and that was my take on like greenwashing and how new development very easily replaces some living communities. The story had 3 acts. We only had 2.5 hours, including introduction to the rules and safety mechanisms, player charter, and stuff like that. So I had to really condense it. In the opening, the redevelopment project is presented with a flashy presentation by the mayor, and that's what you see here on the picture. This character, their name is Echo. This was them having a small sip of tea before they totally derailed the presentation. And I've played this scenario many times, and one of the funny things for me is that everyone always chooses to derail the presentation, not start a dialogue, but just really take it out. And then there was an exploration phase in which the players gather perspectives on the project from the NPCs who are human and more than human as well. Many of them spoke to the tree, for example. And then the last act, like a climax, is a confrontation with either the big bad CEO arrives or the machinery comes, where we played with this tension where no matter if it's legal or not, it really doesn't take a lot of time to cut down a tree. So to conclude, we first imagined how we would like to live in the city and then played make-believe in which some aspects of that imagination were true. So that was the experience I was after for my interlocutors. The goal was to shift what is imaginable and thinkable. An immersion in the story didn't happen for everyone because most of the people didn't have previous experience. And again, it was just 2 hours, so it was very fast. But what I was really happy about is that a reflection on this different way of thinking and imagining happened. Everyone kind of had some new thoughts on it in the debrief interviews. And through shared narration and collective world building, the game allowed interlocutors to feel their way into different urban ecologies. It was kind of beautifully utopian. Most of the directions they took. And the ethics of slowness, reciprocity, and interdependence surfaced as the main aspiration of the participants' dreams for the future, both in the workshops and then this reenactment of this kind of ethics in the game. And these are my references. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much. Okay, so our third presenter on the panel this morning is Amanda Kporwofa. So Amanda, if you are ready. I thought that I saw her in the panelists list. Was I incorrect? Oh no, I see you in here, Amanda.
Yeah, I'm here.
There you are. Hello.
Hey. Right. Can everyone see my screen?
Yeah, we can see it. You might want to put it into presentation mode, but yes.
All right. Yeah, so I'll be talking about Beyond W.E.I.R.D frameworks, rethinking environmental game design from the Global South. And my presenters are Eugenia, Robertson, Maxwell, Emmanuel. They couldn't be here today. But then I really want to thank the whole organization team for accepting this paper. It really means a lot to me. Dr. Turner is always talking to me about the Generation Analog conference, and so I really wanted to present. So I was excited when I got accepted. So thank you. So the first question I want to ask is, what environment, and these are rhetorical questions, so what environmental issue did you learn about as a child? The first one I learned about was hurricanes, and it was a global issue. But at the time, I didn't know anything about it. But now, when I look at it, it was an issue that wasn't part of our major environmental issues that has been experienced in Ghana. And so in Ghana, we've been battling with deforestation, plastic waste, pollution, but I didn't get introduced to that as a child. I rather got introduced with rising sea levels and hurricanes. And so that was the perspective that I had as a child. And it was really difficult for me to connect because I didn't see any of those things in Ghana. None of those things really happened in Ghana, except from the books that I read from. And so what happens when people's environmental issues are missing from education? It's really hard for them to connect, and it's really hard to inspire them to want to take action to solving the environmental problem. And research has shown that environmental education materials that is used across Africa are often imported from the global north or shaped by Western assumptions about pedagogy, culture, and technological access. And a good example is the ATY game by UA Rosenberg. This is a great game that was inspired by Ghana's ATY's forest. And so he's trying to talk about reforestation and fruit bat conservation. But unfortunately, most of the issues that I expressed in that game do not really reflect the Ghanaian culture. It doesn't have Ghanaian cultural elements that we could even connect with. So it's more or less like a generic game which was created by an European. And so when things like this happen, like I said, it's really hard for us to connect with the environmental issues that's happening. And most of this is also stemming from the COP and then the UN conferences that Africans even get to participate in. And you have these solutions drawn up by the Europeans and by the Americans, and then it leaves out our ecological knowledge or how we address environmental issues culturally back in Africa. And the problem is that Africa has unique environmental challenges. The environmental challenges that happen in other parts of the world is surprisingly different in Africa. When I was researching about deforestation before I created a deforestation game, I realized that most of the things that causes deforestation in other parts of the world, like Brazil, is totally different from the causes of deforestation in Ghana. And so we have our own unique environmental issues that happens back home. And also we have distinct ways of learning as well. So in Africa, we usually like to learn through the Anante stories, through Sankofa, which is taking things back from the past and then blending it with modern ways of doing things. And so the gap is many environmental educational resources and games that is used in Africa is developed with different cultural context and environmental context. And as a result, they do not reflect our realities. And it's really difficult for us to influence behavior change. And so you see year in and year out, environmental organizations and advocates, keep coming back to the same thing, keep coming back to solving the same issues in the bid for climate action, but then they're really not tackling the root cause, which is education that has to be tailored to our cultural context. And so the solution is design these games to reflect local realities. When you're talking about plastic waste, be sure that the causes of plastic waste is actually what is happening in Ghana, and not just assume that maybe lack of technology as a cause for plastic pollution in Ghana. You really have to get to the ground to really talk to people, talk to the communities, and ensure that whatever I put in this game, which is reflecting causes for deforestation, is actually the cause for deforestation in Africa. And also embed indigenous ecological knowledge. And so one of the things that most scholars have talked about the reason for why people do not connect to environmental issues is because it's sort of like distant, right? You need to bring it home. You need to include ecological knowledge, include the communities, include the names of people, include traditional wisdom, right? The cultural values and traditions, as well as philosophies in those materials. And also you have to use cultural relevant learning approaches. So incorporate storytelling and community participation to align with African ways of learning and knowledge sharing as well. And so I'm going to talk briefly about a case study for ATI game, which is Ati. So, but most people call it ATI. So Ati is even the name of one of our local languages in Ghana, which means tree or forest. So even if you look at the game, the cover of the game, and you see the name Ati, already connects with you because it's in your local dialect. And so Ati is a deforestation game that seeks to educate children, young people, and adults about the causes and negative effects of deforestation, and as well as promoting environmental sustainability. So this game was made from all of the issues that I raised about. One of the unique thing about this game is that it's really situated in the Ghanaian context. So every cause of deforestation, every negative effect of deforestation, solutions to deforestation, everything or every action that you see on this game is tailored to the Ghanaian context. You really see real time what's really happening in Ghana as far as deforestation is concerned in this game. This game also comes with cultural elements as well. And so we even have the name of the first action, which is a boy planting tree. It's called Ata. We have the names of communities from Achimota Forest embedded in this game. We have the Ghanaian names as well, like Jifa, embedded in this game. Now, one of the things that we just added to this game is the cards, and that card is wisdom from Nana. So when you land on a red action, instead of you getting down, you're just gonna answer a question from the card, and that card is Nana, which is seen as a Ghanaian elder or Ghanaian adult, well respected in his community, talking to you about their previous ways of doing things, right? And also, it's also one of the things that we also included in our new zero waste game, which we're still trying to design or still trying to wrap up. Was one of the example was, Ghanaians usually, our old way of eating is we eat from banana leaves or plantain leaves and not from bowls or plastics. And so today people still practice that. So it's just saying, let's go back to our former ways of doing things. Let's go back to our traditional ways of caring for the environment and seeing how we can fill this gap between the modern ways of caring for the environment. But something interesting with piloting this game in the United States, which brings up an interesting question, is can games from the global south also travel? We've seen games from the global north and Europe traveling to, the African continent, but also asking the question that can these games from Africa also be used or embedded into the curriculums of the global north or in America or in European countries. So we piloted this game in Dr. Evan Turner's class last semester. And one thing that we noticed was, even though this was a cultural game, people still related to it. People played. Some people didn't even consider the fact that it was a cultural game. And so we're saying that maybe this could bring about a unique way of learning or a diverse perspective when it's embedded into the curriculum of countries from the global north. And so then we just realized that when it comes to environmental education, it can be universal, right? Because although there are different ways of approaching the solution or different problems that are, created as far as environmental issue is concerned in these different countries, but then there's still some sort of universal course and solution as well that can culminate together. And so we're saying that even though it's a cultural game, it can be used in other jurisdiction as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, and our final presenter on this panel before we move to the Q&A is going to be Biz Nijdam. So Biz, please take it away.
Thank you so much. I'm just making sure that my slides are showing up appropriately. Hi, everybody. I regret that I'm not able to participate more in the programming over but I had this exciting opportunity. I was invited to Portugal to collaborate with a team of international theaters on a mega game on democracy. So I'm currently in like rural Portugal. And so I hope everyone can hear me all right, because I'm not the Wi-Fi. It looks stable, but you never know when you're in outside of Lisbon. And it's beautiful here. And this project is so meaningful. So I'm excited to do both things at once, but my apologies for probably doing both things not as well as I would have. Okay. I'd like to begin by that the writing of this particular presentation took place at the University of Vancouver on traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. My work in Indigenous studies actually comes from my commitment to this land acknowledgement. I myself am not an Indigenous scholar. I need to acknowledge that outright. I am a white settler scholar of European descent, and I work in German and European studies at the intersections of these fields and Indigenous. My scholarship over the 5 years has sought to identify opportunities to support the work of Indigenous studies, because as a Europeanist, I see it as my responsibility to support the work of Truth and Reconciliation and respond to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, because settler colonialism is a European invention, white supremacy is a European invention, and Eurocentrism is a European invention. And these, oh, something just blinked. Am I still, okay, I'm still on the camera, great. And these structures that are systematically racist and oppressive are not only continuing the cultural genocide by the Canadian Indian residential school system, but they're also hurting all of Canada's people, settler and Indigenous alike. So this work is particularly invested in Indigenous ways of knowing and working and community engagement, and I just really need to foreground my own positionality while doing that work. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about games and land-based epistemology. Color green. But what I learned over the course of this research kind of gets me to a different place, which is exciting. Games have almost always, either explicitly or implicitly, been. However, the way land figured in relationship to transnational histories of play is as varied as the games themselves. For example, chess, which likely evolved from the Indian 6th century game chaturanga, is essentially a miniature battlefield in which the pieces represent 4 branches of an army: first infantry, cavalry, elephants, and chariots, and eventually the pawns, knights, bishops, and rooks of modern chess. Here, controlling the space is central to play. Even though victory does not require occupying the most space, it requires trapping the king. Territorial control is at the foundation of the game's challenge. Even when not explicit, however, gaming is still, skip something here. There. Even when advancement in tabletop gaming is still generally territorialized and spatialized, even when there isn't necessarily a board, such as with role-playing games, to move forward, even narratively, is to move forward in space and time. In Snakes and Ladders, this traveling from 1 to 100 upwards, often with the help of ladders as 20, and in the game of life, this a literal road trip in a car populated with various colors, depending on the era of the game, though through the characteristics of a successful life. Games such as Risk and War Games made the abstraction of chess's land's role in territorial games more explicit. Battleship and Strategos popularized mechanics that drew from narratives of war and territorial control as well. Today, fantasy games are equally likely to engage in narrative strategies that require the domination of land, such as War of the Ring or Dune War for Arrakis, and even games. And then there are those games that explicitly thematize land in other ways, such as Ticket to Ride or Candyland. And this is a particularly interesting example, one that I get the sense we've already talked about beyond this panel even, because it was designed with land practices in mind. When Lizzie Maggie first designed Monopoly, which was initially known as the Landlord's Game, there were 2 ways to play. The Monopolist version requires players to acquire as much real estate as possible, charging corrupt their opponents, and the prosperity version. In the prosperity version, however, the competitors worked as allies to build a healthy economy. In this sense, according to Maggie, the landlord's game is a practical demonstration of the present system of land grabbing with all its usual outcomes and consequences. Maggie designed the landlord's game to demonstrate the negative consequences of monopolies and the benefits of land value tax, intending to show that the anti-monopoly version of play was also the best and most moral path for society. However, that's not the version of the game we play today. I think this is a very telling example of the relationships with land popular games have constructed, because, according to John Green, quote, "There are monopoly, but maybe the reason the game has persisted so long is that the problems are our problems." And then, the position of land in global gaming cultures changed once again. In dialogue with the which sought to avoid the brutality of war and explicit conflict of the Second World War, German game designer Klaus to a different politics of land to reinvent tabletop gaming. And in 1995, there was a Catan, in which competition over territory, i.e. land, became competition over resources, i.e. still land. Here, territorial expansion took on new dimensions and adopted the mechanics of settler colonialism in what Tuber likely perceived to be a quote-unquote more peaceful approach to the narratives of territorial acquisition and control of war games. But these manifestations of the role of land in gaming cultures embody an inherently colonial worldview. It's even in Settlers of Catan's title, even though they rebranded. In most games, land in these games and in most games is an object of possession, a means of establishing control, or a marker for advancement. Rich with resources or featuring the building blocks for power consolidation, games that engaged with land have historically not endeavored to of learning, nor have popular game mechanics that draw from colonial world views of land ownership, exploitation, and use been designed for different kinds of ways of living with or alongside the land. However, research continues to show that tabletop games offer exciting avenues for education, reimagining, and reinvest with land. By inviting engage in embodied learning that restructures with reality, games are well positioned to move to influence, quote, how people interact with game story and message other and the world around them. This presentation reflects on game design as a decolonial arts-based research practice and educational tool, as well as a means for Indigenous self-determined storytelling, focusing specifically on tabletop games as a tool for reflecting land-based epistemologies and drawing from my own community-engaged research project, Games for Decolonization. In this presentation, I'll explore what my reflections and also the reflections of our Indigenous game design partners, because some of the material is coming from a survey, what happens when a team of Indigenous game designers are invited to create games based on modern manifestations of Indigenous traditional physical culture, what otherwise might be known as Indigenous sports. The Games for Decolonization project is out of the UBC Critical Play Lab and turns to tabletop gaming as a new avenue for sharing stories of historical and contemporary Indigenous experience. Working in collaboration with Cree tabletop game consultant David Plamondon of Paymetaway Games and 3 Indigenous game designers, James Darren Corbier, an Anishinaabe cartoonist, artist, and game designer behind the Truth and Reconciliation game, Luke Parnell, a Haida Niska carver and game designer, and Chris Clark, a Métis video game programmer and tabletop game designer. This work, our collaboration, seeks to support sovereignty in game design while striving to establish best practices in Indigenous for game development, grow a network of Indigenous partners in the gaming industry, tabletop oriented, and develop expertise in Indigenous gaming cultures, while creating a collection of games that will both function as open access educational resources and game prototypes for the designers to take whatever direction they want to potentially advance their own careers in a meaningful way. At the core of this work was our recent trip to the Arctic Winter Games in Whitehorse, Yukon, for those of you that are not as familiar with the Canadian provinces and territories, in March 2026, where a group of Indigenous and settler researchers sought to support our team of game designers and a group of 6 Indigenous cartoonists in developing media inspired by the competition. The Arctic Winter Games is a high-profile circumpolar sporting competition for Northern and Arctic athletes and a multicultural exposition for the circumpolar world. The games take place every 2 years and celebrate sport, social exchange, and culture while providing an opportunity for developing athletes to participate in friendly competition, share cultural values of the global Indigenous North, including the northern regions of Canada, Alaska, Greenland, and Sapmi. Based on the traditional survival skills, hunting, fishing, and daily life of Indigenous peoples in the northern regions of Canada, Alaska, and Greenland and parts of Scandinavia, these games were developed to test and increase strength, speed, and endurance, pain tolerance, and mental agility, preparing individuals for the harsh realities of living off the land in these Nordic parts of the world. First, I'll briefly introduce the Arctic Winter Games and the research design of the board game prototypes, and then I'll turn to some reflections I've had in dialogue with my partners about the role of games in decolonial education, discourses of Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination, and land-based knowledges more broadly. While the Arctic Winter Games feature familiar transnational winter sports such as skiing and speed skating, the Dene Games and Arctic sports are what most clearly set this transnational sporting competition apart. The game's own materials emphasize that these events are rooted in Northern and Indigenous lifeways and land-based epistemologies, with competitions such as stick pole tied to fishing, snow snake tied to ice hunting practices, hand games to longstanding forms of gathering and exchange, and events like 1-foot high kick, kneel jump, and knuckle hop grounded in strength, endurance, and survival while hunting on the ice. So we wondered what happens when you bring the modality of tabletop gaming in dialogue with the traditional physical culture at the foundation of the Dene and Arctic sports. Well, until we know yet, the games are we're just starting to play 3 games, and so the prototypes aren't complete, but we do have some preliminary thoughts that have been emerging by way of our conversations around the game development. First, preliminary observations note how tabletop game design brings the stories, the storytelling, and the traditional knowledges back in concrete and visible dialogue with the physical competitions, which are at this point in time now quite distanced when we see them being reproduced at sort of the Olympic style gaming competitions, not when they're actually supporting youth and mentors or elders in the practice of ice fishing, but when they're in that sort of Olympic style competition, we lose track of their origins. And this game design initiative seems to be bringing the stories back in dialogue with these practices. After all, following Gordon Clapper's work on Indigenous designed video games, quote, stories are at the heart of indigeneity, stories are at the heart of games, and stories are vital to Indigenous games. So turning to the games themselves, Chris Cook's forthcoming prototype, for example, will focus on the origins of stick pull, a strength and endurance competition which consists of 2 participants standing back to back and holding onto a stick covered in grease as they attempt to pull the stick from the opponent. Like many other Arctic and Dene sports, it has its origins in ice fishing. The greasy stick tests the participant's grip and is akin to holding a fish by the tail. While not ice fishing, Dene fishermen would practice stick pull to improve their grip and become better at holding on to caught fish. Traditionally, bear grease was used for stick pull, but today's competition normally feature Crisco instead. In Cook's version of this game, he reintegrates the fish into this activity. He intends to craft a game that plays with the tension of slippery fish in an ice fishing narrative context. Second, these games are functioning to highlight the sportsmanship and community building of these events in unique ways, which is becoming the core principle in the collection of comics that Cole Pauls is editing in collaboration with the Indigenous cartoonists participating in the project. In this context, the prototype focuses on pin trading, the highly celebrated quote-unquote unofficial 21st sport of the Arctic Winter Games, in which athletes, coaches, and volunteers from across the circumpolar north swap regional team and media enamel pins to spark conversations, make friends, and take home tangible memories of their cultural and athletic experiences. In addition to the community building aspects of pin trading itself, sportsmanship is formally integrated into the Arctic Winter Games pin culture, and alongside regional badges, the Arctic Winter Games International Committee awards the distinctive Fair Play Pin, the team of athletes and coaches who best exemplify the game's spirit of fair play and camaraderie. Will feature original art that thematizes both the tradition of pin trading as well as the games themselves. The sense of collaboration is likewise integrated into James Darren Corbier's game prototype Polar Vortex, a cooperative game that highlights the 5 characteristics common to all of the athletes participating in the Arctic Winter Games: knowledge, training, skill, strength, and determination. Instead of focusing on the games themselves and their competitive qualities to win Polar Vortex, players must work together to collect these to achieve success as they navigate the polar region. Moreover, Arctic Winter Games' spirit of community cooperation has also informed the designer's own experiences of game design as arts-based. Chris Cook observed that to be around so many great artists and designers, of discovering a new thing, the games themselves, is really inspiring. Right word, I think, because it's this feel strongly in our trip, and it matched a lot of the sense and it made a lot of sense that the participants of the games described that too. So to conclude, I'd like to close with an anecdote Luke Parnell shared via WhatsApp as we were wrapping up our time in Whitehorse. He wrote, "I was thinking, back when I was an apprentice carver, my mentor, a master carver, and the other apprentice out to the old highway to cut down an alder tree to get some carving wood. We found an amazing, perfect for carving." Luke Parnell is an accomplished carver and artist and just really wants to games. And so he kind of balances these two worlds as this carver who spends his free time designing games. We found an amazing alder tree that was perfect for carving. On the way back to the shed, we ran into Dale Campbell, a female master carver, and told her about the elder log. The next day, master carvers Dempsey Bob, Stan Bevan, and Ken came by the shed, and we told them about the alder log. I was thinking about all the master carvings that came out of that alder tree, and I was thinking about this trip. It's like the alder tree. We are all going to learn from this experience and go off and create a masterwork. And I think about all those masterworks that will come out of this tree. We've been thinking a lot about this anecdote, and honestly, I burst into tears when he sent it via WhatsApp because it was just such a powerful experience traveling with this group of cartoonists and in the context of game design, thinking about this anecdote in the context of game design as research and what it might offer Indigenous sovereignty and storytelling, come to realize is that Indigenous sovereignty in game design means that Indigenous gamers should be designing whatever games they want. As settler and Indigenous scholars, we intentionally designed the Games for Decolonization project, game development, as a form of decolonial education. Games, the role the Arctic Winter Games played in positioning this game design in direct dialogue with the Indigenous land-based. But we've collectively come to realize how important it is to support Indigenous folks in telling whatever stories they want. And reducing Indigenous game design to land-based epistemologies is essentialist and inadvertently, or explicitly, or intentionally sometimes, continues to reinforce colonial perspectives on Indigenous and contemporary and traditional knowledges. What stands out most about our trip to the Arctic Winter Games is how much the trip affirmed the value of this work, grounded in relational research practices and co-created arts-based inquiry. Winter Games provided a powerful setting for building relationships, the logical approach to game design as research, exchanging ideas, and work together, masterworks that might spring from this trip. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Biz, and thank you so much to all of our panelists for the amazing papers. So just as a reminder, or if you weren't here with us yesterday, we have some time for Q&A, and there's a couple places that you could submit your questions. So you could use the Q&A function in Zoom if you would like to add a question there, or I'm also in the Discord, and I'm in our Designing Green Day 2 Session 1 little subsection of the Discord, and you can post your questions there if you would like as well. And in fact, we do have our first question from the Discord. So Evan has a question for Amanda, and Evan asks, how do the game mechanics in your game help promote the kinds of community around environmental action that you want to foster?
All right. So first off, the game mechanics that we used was sort of like modified from a bit of it was modified from the chutes and ladders because what we wanted to achieve was to make it familiar for the Ghanaian audience. So in Ghana, we play our own snake and ladder game, which we play at the back of the Ludo. And so one thing that we wanted to teach the people were wanted to teach them about the negative effects of deforestation and what actually causes deforestation. So when it came to the courses, which is you landing on a red action, you actually go down. And so that's sort of like telling you that this is a bad action. And then when you get to the green action, which is a good action, which is planting trees, you actually win points and then you just go up. And so that's also something we wanted to tell them that, hey, planting trees is good, right? Reforestation is a good practice. Um, Agroforestry is a good practice. And so we use that rewards and punishment concept to sort of like influence behavior change and try to make them see actions that they could take to promote climate action or environmental action.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much. While folks are pulling their questions together as well, of course, panelists, if you have questions for one another, you're absolutely welcome to ask each other some questions.
I've noted a question from the Discord log.
Oh, say it again, sorry.
Evan, I've noted a question from Evan to my talk. And
Oh, is it farther back? Did I lose
how
it?
does the history of color in board games intersect with the colonial history of color? And as far as I would tackle this question, is that the colonial history of color is mainly a history of extractive practices that were used to, I don't know, get indigo or any other color you can think of into get your hands on a specific color, and therefore it is of course always a matter of game production. Like so, I would treat this as a not necessarily as a question of meaning production on the game table. I wouldn't go so far that if you have some materials where there is that have been retrieved brutally or with other questionable methods, that somebody who plays such a game is instantly kind of tainted by these materials. So that's not what I think material history of board games would look like. Yeah. Still, we have to engage critically with the ways of how products or resources are coming about. Yeah. I don't know if that's answering your question.
I think it does actually because of the nature of it kind of absolves the European color history from this colonial color history, which I think is interesting. So to some degree, this is indigenous European board game history.
Mm.
I'm going back through the Discord to make sure that I didn't miss any other ones in the chat. There are several people typing, so we're all waiting with bated breath. While folks are typing, I guess I have a question for Biz, and I guess it's kind of an open-ended question. I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about how the research and design collaboration that you described in your paper kind of came about, like institutionally, if you have any knowledge on that background, like, how were you able to put together that team and how can you help us all if we wanted to craft such a team? How would we be able to do that at our institutions?
Slow and through contacts. I mean, it began with me and also Canadian government funding, which is available to all of you around the world. You just have to find yourself a Canadian. Really, it's quite an internationally oriented structure that also hopes to take advantage of Horizon funding, which is the Europe version, which is larger. So funding angle, government funding, just find a Canadian. Then when it comes to the institutional part, I began by it began for me with Settlers of Catan, really trying to find ways to teach Indigenous studies and German studies. And so I cold emailed David, who is the pre-board game owner and consultant, and invited him to speak to my class, and then invited him to UBC to talk about some angles of this work. And then I also, there was an article about Luke in the CBC. And so I emailed him and was just like, hi, I think what you do is really cool. And slowly I tried to find opportunities to support these artists doing different things in and around Vancouver. And together, when I brought up the Arctic Winter Games, they're like, oh, that would be fun. I was like, well, I maybe we could go together. And so it was really a slow moving and collaborative research design that was in some ways by word of mouth, sometimes me cold emailing people and just trying to reach out and build that relationship slowly. And now one of the most wonderful things about this work is that while there are Indigenous game designers across Canada and the United States, and I don't mean to be saying that what I'm doing is I mean, there's a Snakes and Ladders version on decolonial decision making. There's Coyote and Crow, Nunami, made by a Nook artist. There's a lot of Indigenous design games, but we could definitely have more. And through this collaboration, we've sort of started networking, and there's a bit more of a support structure. Are now in conversation with each other, and I'm just there sometimes, and really it's that's so interesting and important and wonderful and fun to witness. So yeah, it began with inviting people to do guest lectures in my building that trust, because I don't think just anybody would be like, yeah, I'll totally go with you to Winnipeg, or not Winnipeg, Whitehorse for a week. I'll trust that you're going to rent us cold weather gear and probably get a van and drive us around everywhere. I mean, it's the big thing to take. I think there was 22 of us on the team, including researchers and cartoonists and game designers. And I got to drive the big truck. It was awesome. One of my greatest accomplishments. We called him Jean-Claude Damban. Love it.
Judging by the Discord, we're going to have to open up an area on the Generation Analog Discord that's called like "Get Yourself a Canadian." It looks like.
I'm sorry.
Everyone was like, "Okay, we took that advice. Fantastic."
Yeah, no, really. I mean, there is actually, Petr, some of the work that you were doing. We're trying to explore games as research and game design as research. So we're trying to do some grant writing about that, and then I'm also looking at trying to solve or grapple with wicked problems using game design literacies. So you can just email me. I'm already a Canadian, and I like collaborators. Working together is more fun.
Thank you so much.
I got a Dane. That also helps. They don't have to be Canadian. Danes are also good.
I have a Dane too. But yeah, I was just in Copenhagen. They've got like crazy game stores. It was amazing. I was blown away. It was very exciting for me.
Well, okay, so I'm going to switch gears a little bit to a different question, but this is exactly why this is like an advertisement for the Generation Analog Discord, because this is a great place for people to foster collaborations. So thank you all. So I have a two-part question for Petr. Part one comes from Caleb, and Caleb asks, Is Nalluvia available online? I'm doing a PhD in sociology, and my project also links game creation and multiple ontologies as a space for different worlds to encounter with each other. So I'm interested in knowing with more detail how different practices and worlds are represented in game. And then part two of this question for Peter comes from Benjamin. So Benjamin asks, do you have any theories on why the players chose the actions that they did? So is it available online anywhere? And can you share maybe in the Discord where, if so? And then also, do you have any theories as to why players chose the actions that they did?
Thank you for the questions. So it is unfortunately not, but that's only my fault and not having time. I am planning to make it online on Edge, but I never got to it. I didn't get to it yet, but it will be, and then I'm definitely gonna shout out somewhere online that it's available. And the answer to the second question is, I think, a little bit connected to both the game design or the scenario design, but also to who I played with. So for the research games, I played with environmental NGO employees and also environmental activists in Prague. So it was quite natural for them, I think, to just really go into it and start fighting. For the NGO employees, it was really sweet to see how they both approached it as it's kind of their work as well. So they immediately started project managing and split the group and started researching law and stuff in the game. But then they also saw it as like a permission structure to just really go full on and fuck shit up. I'm sorry, don't really know how else to say it. Because they couldn't do that without ridicule in their real jobs, and especially in Prague, or in the Czech context, it's a precarious living to do this kind of work because you can very easily be delegitimized with like you're a regressive communist kind of thing. That's a very historical context there. And then the activists, they were used to playing like this, and then they just did it in the game as well. There were some attempts at compromise. In one of the groups, they like convinced the architect to build a smaller building around the tree, so there was still a building. In the other one, they just totally destroyed the plan.
Thank you very much. We have another question in the Zoom Q&A, and this is a question for Biz. So Alenda asks, I know the AWG organizers have acknowledged climate change's impact on the circumpolar north, and I'm wondering if that was a concern at all for athletes with regard to the playing conditions or if it possibly affected game design brainstorming.
So, I mean, we all know that climate change doesn't manifest in everything just being warmer. What happened during the games was the opposite. There were 3 days that were unusually cold. It was minus 26 degrees in the morning. And so the conversation, and I attended a few of the leadership meetings, what do they call them? The chefs meetings. Because we were partnered with the Arctic Winter Games International Committee. It was a true collaboration. It wasn't just that we showed up. And that wasn't the conversation so much, but I do know how much it really is impacting the kinds of subsistence practices that these are based off of. And also like food preservation strategies. I mean, it's a huge impact and it's acknowledged, but it didn't become part of the discourse so much in the games or in the annual, the gala, the cultural gala they hold, was more on celebrating the revival, the renewal, the cultural resurgence, but also the hybridity of modern and traditional practices. And so it was very oriented towards that kind of celebration. I think moving forward, it's going to be a more important element of that conversation, depending on where it is and how well they acknowledge climate change is impacting the games. I was really interested in supporting artists and working on these games because of how the sports or is in direct dialogue with subsistence practices that have to change due to climate change. But that hasn't of itself. And I hope to support that through other avenues, but I was not going to tell anybody what games to do. That. Thanks for the question.
All right. Do we have any other questions for our panelists? All right. Well, our next session is going to begin at 11 a.m. Eastern. And it is our second keynote. So Ed, is there anything that you wanted to say scheduling wise regarding to that?
Oh no. Yeah, so it's Matteo Menapace, who is the co-designer of Daybreak, which has been mentioned a couple of times. Since we have a little bit of time, I'm going to have the panelists go away or go back to, and then we'll just have the AGS team come up and just introduce ourselves again for the audience that's here, since we didn't get a chance to do it this morning. But thank you to panelists in Designing Green. Amazing, awesome, really interesting work. I was just saying in Discord that everyone's project is so cool, and I don't know what I'm doing with my life. So cool. So I'll have so I'm just going to introduce folks and then or myself, and then I'll just pass the baton. So if you don't know, I'm Ed Chang. I'm an associate professor of English at Ohio University. I am the current editor-in-chief of Analog Game Studies. And I didn't get a chance to say yesterday that Analog Game Studies right now, if you don't know, is in the midst of a big migration from our poor little WordPress, which, gets attacked every day by ne'er-do-wells. So we are currently migrating to University of California's eScholarship platform. It's not as pretty, but the great thing is that it will be preserved for as long as eScholarship exists. Everything is indexed and given a DOI number and all that good stuff. And so it's been really important because one of my, pillars of my editorship is citational justice. And I think it's really, really important that so much of the work that Analog Game Studies has hosted isn't being cited. And I would like to make sure that it's super visible. And in that vein, we are still always accepting rolling submissions. And so please, 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 please submit. And if you have questions about that, you can always reach out and email analoggamestudiejournal@gmail.com or me or any one of us, or use Discord. And then to pitch again, Alinda Chang, who is keynote yesterday, is our special guest editor for a special issue on environmental analog games. And that call is open now, and I'll repost it in a second. So please, if you have any idea of turning whatever you're working on for this into an essay, that would be great. So I will pass it to Megan, since we were just talking.